Okay, hi, I'm Andy Brown. This is our second video for our Humanities 2 class here in the spring of 2021. Well, let me calm down here a little bit. A little bit of a mission impossible today, because today I want to cover the High Renaissance, the two main figures of the High Renaissance. There are, sorry, you've got the early Renaissance, Brunelleschi and Donatello, and they're sort of a pair. And then you have another painter from that period named Fra Angelico, who's also very, very interesting. And so they're sort of a trio. And then for the High Renaissance, you've got Leonardo and Michelangelo, who are also kind of a pair. Again, the stereotype is that Leonardo sort of the intellectual one, and Michelangelo kind of the tempestuous artist. Again, sort of a stereotype. And then the third of that High Renaissance trio would be Raphael. We're not really going to look at Fra Angelica or Raphael, but you might consider Raphael's School of Athens a nice linear perspective painting that's also very famous. But in any event, I want to talk today about Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. As I say, a little bit of a mission impossible, but my goal with these videos is just to give you really basic introduction to sort of get you going. And also, I think that on these, basically, I'm sort of telling you what I have to say about them. So it's sort of a document of that. What that's worth, which isn't very much. Okay, so let me get to my, there we go. Oh, sorry. I'm so low tech today. It's really bad. Sorry about that. Sorry. Right. Now you're all like, oh my God, look at this guy. He's a mess. Well, you're right. Okay. So yes, as I say, here we are, Renaissance masters Leonardo and Michelangelo. I would like to put them in some kind of context. I guess for me, speaking as a humanist, an art historian, certainly a philosopher, it's really true that cultures and civilizations sort of rise up. I talk about the flower blooming on the vine. The flower being a place and a time that provides a context for individuals to realize themselves in a very particular kind of way. It's the more you look at that, the more you realize how very much individuals are products of their place and time, I think. 5th century Athens, 5th century BCE Athens, I think is an example. The activity around the Industrial Revolution in England in the late 18th century, I think maybe is an example. But certainly around Florence during the 15th century, the 1400s, and then the 16th century, the 1500s notably, and with Leonardo and Michelangelo, we make that transition. We come out of that early period and come out into the modern period, really. So we want to see these flourishing people, but I would always emphasize that people rise up to the context that they're given. It's about creating the situation where people will do the right thing and creating a situation where people will realize themselves. And I think that's really an important part of understanding history. So let's start off with Leonardo da Vinci. One of my very favorite people, I must say. I think, he's certainly one of my culture gods. Let me just say I'm a Leonardo fanboy all the way. I mean, he'd have to be on the top, half dozen or so people. And just because he's this incredible flowering of sort of pure genius and curiosity. I mean, and all he does is just produce knowledge, in a way that's just extravagant. He's got an output that is almost unbelievable. Some of these historical figures, I mentioned Aristotle, a lot of writers, Picasso, and a lot of people just do so much that it's really hard to believe that one person possibly did it. Da Vinci's like that. He was an illegitimate son of the sort of notary public in a little village called Da Vinci. So he's Leonardo da Vinci, Leonardo from Vinci is what that means. It comes from very humble origins from outside the city of Florence. And he was mostly famous during his lifetime for the public things that he did. He made paintings, of course, that many people saw, and other works like that. And he also produced parades and events and things for his employers. And he also was an important military engineer for his employers. So that was, I mentioned that because that's something else that people appreciated about him at the time. But later on, I mean, a lot of his notebooks weren't really organized by him. There were different sizes of sheets of paper. He just did it all the time. These drawings of pencil and charcoal, and he wrote backwards. He wrote a mirror image prose for thousands. It was about 5,000 pages of this. And there probably was maybe over 20,000 pages originally of these notebooks. Maybe someday we'll find some more, but I doubt it now. It's been a long time. But we have a few codexes. These are bound volumes that various collectors put together over the centuries. But in any event, I guess getting to the next slide actually, but in any event, when people started to look over his notebooks, they started to see another level of depth to Leonardo. And this notion of the so-called Renaissance man, the person who can do anything, who knows everything, is really owing, all these people sort of do that because these are artisans who are expected to do what their employers want them to do. And they do a lot of different things, and that's expected. So the Renaissance man applies to the community too, but Da Vinci's kind of takes it to another level. First of all, let's look at a couple of paintings. As I say, during his life, Leonardo, people would say, well, he made paintings. The Mona Lisa, of course, the most frequently reproduced painting in history. I saw it in Paris, small, really small, with a whole bunch of people around it, but a very mysterious painting in very many ways. It's Providence. People have all sorts of myths about it. There's another painting underneath it. Actually, there are other paintings underneath a lot of these paintings because they would just do that with canvases. They just paint over all things. So there are masterpieces on masterpieces in these works. It's known who this person was. He painted it on commission. It's, she's a lady who's known. Look at that linear perspective we were talking about last time. This is a fresco on a wall, on stucco. So it's not been in very good shape. This is a nice reproduction of it. I would note a couple things about looking at this painting, and so sort of getting a sense of what the Renaissance is and what it's all about. Look, first of all, obviously, of course, there's a linear perspective, and the vanishing point is Jesus's head. It's also got a halo formed by the lintel of the door above it. Pretty basic. But then notice also levels. So look at 3 levels. You've got the tabletop, then you've got the level of the top of the heads of the people, and then you've got the level above that. And you'll often have these balancing spaces on the tops of these Renaissance 17th and 18th century paintings, actually. And then there are other compositional things that you start to notice once you start to look at it in terms of kind of having a composition. I mean, composition isn't just sort of symmetry. Composition for a painter is also about you look at the painting, there's a place where people are going to look at the painting first. Obviously here that's Jesus. And then the eye is going to be drawn into other directions. And good painters are very much aware of this, very much thinking about what part of the painting you're going to look at first, and then where your eye is going to go, and the story, the adventure that's going to be for you. And that's really a lot about what we mean by composition in painting. So in this case, for example, if you look over on the left, you see the figure of Judas, and I don't have to tell you which one is the figure of Judas, because it's obvious. This is a painting on wood. Its provenance is actually somewhat questions. Not everybody thinks it's completely Leonardo. Look at that glass sphere held in the left hand. But in any event, Badir bin Abdullah bought this for $450 million. Since when it hasn't been seen, we heard that it's on Prince Salman's yacht, is what I read today. But I want to say something about that and why I mentioned the $450 million. It's bullshit. $450 million is bullshit. All this big money, all these people with all these billions of dollars really ruined the art market completely, because these are just status, conspicuous consumption purchases. And all of the great masterpieces now are just held captive by this awful system like Imperial Rome, where these plutocrats and people with their billions of dollars just buy up everything. And, you know, it's gross, and nobody should be paying $450 million for painting. So that's a little editorial about the art situation today. Of course, these are the old masters. So in terms of the art market, in terms of forgeries, in terms of amount of scholarship, you know, this is it. This is the most studied objects. All right, now I want to get to my real favorite, though, the thing that does, I do admit this jazzes me a lot, and that's Leonardo's notebooks. They are amazing. What I want to stress here is his creativity, but notice it as a creativity informed by scholarship. Leonardo, working in the 16th century, anticipated, for example, Galileo, claiming that the moon was normal rocks like rocks on Earth, and that sort of thing. Leonardo's all over all kinds of things. I want to end by talking about, and the Leonardo part, by talking about his work on anatomy. As I say, he writes backwards. He just writes backwards for thousands of pages, millions of words. People who study the notebooks, there's a funny thing about Leonardo. He kind of drifts along. He doesn't really have an overall plan. He's not somebody like, he's not like Charles Darwin. He's not saying, okay, I need a theory to explain. I mean, he just goes from one thing to another. He's just curious. And, you know, he's very well compensated. Leonardo is very, very valuable to his patrons. Leonardo is very famous. In any event, they're just what he did all day. So the calculator, again, around the beginning of the 16th century, he is sketching a calculator, a metal calculator, that a geared up calculator, where every time the first one hits 10, the other one moves one, and he can do that out to a whole bunch of decimals. And, you know, he's designing a computer, you know, no biggie. Using the sun, he studied the sun a lot. He used to consider the sun as an object, you know, looking at solar flares and things. But he also said, look, I mean, people probably already had various means of using sunlight to heat up the water. He just had he worked with lenses. He also thought maybe you could use concave lenses or to focus light, to make light beams, ray guns and stuff. So he understood that solar power, what could be done with it, just harness the energy coming out of the sun, and he worked on that a lot. He said you can make air you can heat up the air and it'll rise. It was in Paris about 200 years later that someone finally did that. But as you can see, these are actually, he actually sketched that balloon in the center. I'm not sure that one, that is that. He used to make parades, as I said. He used to make floats and parades and things for the plazas for festivals. And so he already had all the technology that he sort of needed when it came time. Remember, when we look at both of these weapon systems that Leonardo was involved in developing, they were involved in siege warfare. So you had a city with walls around it, typically, and it was surrounded. And the question was, who could outlast the other? And they were firing heavy, big mortar shells, the big flat mortars over the walls. So he worked on a couple of things, tanks, because as I say, he already had the technology for that from his parade floats, tanks so you could get up close to the walls, but also mortars and ballistics. You know, it's funny because when you look at the Cold War and sort of the missile race and the nuclear race, it's all about ballistics, it's all about the throw weights of the missiles. And Leonardo really was the beginner of that. I mean, he said, okay, well, he's going to start to work on the bores of the mortars and their angles and do the math and figure it out. He got it that if you had enough airflow, you would get enough lift to pick up a heavier than air object. Again, remember, this is Leonardo lives when, you know, Christopher Columbus sails. I mean, that's when this is. And he said, well, you could build a helicopter, you know. And he was right. He understood, and his sketches aren't bad. You know. So this is the thing. I mean, Leonardo was just walking around, just overflowing with this stuff just all the time. Look at that. Does that remind you of anything? Does that look like something you might go buy down at the mall? As I say, one of the greatest anatomists who ever lived, did a lot of dissection. People in the 20th century were still discovering structures that Leonardo discovered 500 years earlier. That is, physical organs in the body that people didn't know about, Leonardo had found and drawn and knew about. So that's really quite extraordinary. I'll try and put some of those links up. There are some really extraordinary stories of people, scientists, that discovering things in Leonardo's notebooks that were the answers to questions that they were looking for. Embryology, everything, the nervous system, all of the systems. So a big symbol of the Renaissance, Vitruvian Man. We heard from Vitruvius's Architectura before. It was written in the 1st century BCE, so a really long time, about 2,100 years ago, before the time of Christ, shortly, when the Caesars were rising up out of the Roman Republic. And so Vitruvius, remember, Brunelleschi was reading Vitruvius, and Brunelleschi was finding out about Platonic ideas from reading Vitruvius. And Leonardo, possibly from Brunelleschi, I wouldn't be surprised, found out also about Vitruvius. And he drew this Vitruvian Man. There are a number of other versions of this by other artists. And it wasn't actually until the 18th century, the 1800s, the 19th century, about 200 years ago, when someone reproduced for the first time out of the notebooks this drawing of Vitruvian Man. Since then, over the last 200 years, it has become a very frequently reproduced symbol of the Renaissance. So there's a whole, you can go find out all kinds of stuff about just this drawing about Vitruvian Man. Michelangelo, put a picture of him there. It looks kind of modern. Doesn't look like I thought Michelangelo would look. Michelangelo is biographically interesting. I encourage you to look up the biographies of these people if you're interested in them. But he had a hard life because he was a very tempestuous person. Gentlemen at that time and place used to, something terrible. I say he died. He didn't actually live for 300 years. I just noticed that on the slide. 1564. Okay. To be 200 and whatever years old. I'm sorry about that. I'll have to fix that. All right. So like Leonardo, Michelangelo too, well, in his case, his mother passed away and his father, a busy and wealthy man, had Michelangelo grow up in a very beautiful and bucolic, actually. Michelangelo remembered his childhood as being a wonderful childhood out at this marble quarry that his father owned. And his nanny, the lady that was paid to take care of him, and her husband was a stone cutter. So Michelangelo just basically grew up with a chisel and an anvil and a hammer in his hand. I mean, he is the kind of sculptor where, think if you wanted to make somebody a great like violinist or tennis player, then you would take them when they were about, maybe 5 years old or something, and you'd start them in on it. Pretty hardcore and pretty much stay there. But Michelangelo is this very unusual example of someone who actually grew up carving on pretty nice marble, you know, and it shows. I mean, in fact, some of these unbelievable pieces that he actually does when he's in his 20s. He went to Rome at the age of 21. He and most of his great works, he has works in the Vatican, and that's another part of the reason why Michelangelo. Well, we'll get to the Sistine Chapel, which is in the Vatican. And so Michelangelo is sort of the superstar. He's like, what's the comparison? If Leonardo is Bach, Michelangelo is Mozart, right? Michelangelo is this sort of boy genius. And he becomes very, very famous. He doesn't really want to do other things, and that's kind of ironic, as I say, because he paints the Sistine Chapel. We'll get to that in a second. So here's the Pieta, carved out of a solid piece of marble. Look at the folds of the drapery. What you should do is go online and look at details, for example, of the face of the Virgin and so on, because it's absolutely exquisite carving out of a solid block of marble. But he did it when he was your age, for most of you. He did it when he was in his early 20s. He did, and so, as you say, I mean, you know, you don't sort of go to sculpture class and learn how to do that. This is a man who grew up he literally grew up in a marble quarry, literally. The David was a popular figure. We already saw Donatello's David. His David is Michelangelo's David, 17 feet tall. Now, so we talk about the Renaissance. You think of the Parthenon in Athens. The Parthenon looks like a perfectly sort of straight and symmetrical building, but it was built on the top of a hill. And if you built a building that was actually perfectly straight on the top of the hill, then from the bottom of the hill, it would look slightly bowed. That's what the optics are like. So the Greek architects, classical Greek architects, bowed the actual structure to correct so that the structure actually appears to be straight, appears to be straighter than it would if it were natural. And, you know, that's sort of that classical ideal, the form, perfection. And so when you look at a torso by Michelangelo, he too is not really going for naturalism. He's going for perfect symmetry. He's going for the Apollonian. The other thing about the David, it was placed in a piazza, actually facing towards Rome, eventually in Florence. It's David, right, versus Goliath, coming to represent the Florentine Republic in hard times. So that's another reason why his David became a beloved statue. Now, as I say in the last bullet point on this slide here, you could do a semester's course on the Sistine Chapel. I mean, easily, because there are several different topics that are all coming together, including architecture, because Michelangelo has this very intricately fluted architectural ceiling, and he has to cover all of the different spots in it. And so, so he does it. He paints this, again, he's still pretty young, to build the scaffolding, to design the scaffolding and build it up to the ceiling so he could lay on his back and paint it. That took about a year. I already mentioned, I think, that Leonardo had gone out and looked at Brunelleschi's hoisting equipment. It was a big issue because, remember, these artists, they also mix their own colors, by the way. I mean, you know, they didn't go down to the paint store and get their paints. They made their paints themselves and most of their stuff. You know, then they had, by the time they were in the big studios, they had artisans making their equipment, but they had to build a lot of stuff from the ground up. 343 figures, both biblical figures and figures from the Greek and Roman classics, all mixed together on the Sistine Chapel. That's what it looks like. And then he also paints, of course, the fresco at the end, the resurrection. So see how the actual architectural elements, And the architectural elements that he's painting in, you can't really tell exactly. I mean, where it's hard to tell from this reproduction, where are you looking at the building and where are you looking at the painting? And that is a direct copy of Roman painting. And Roman painting also had what they called the horror vacui, the horror of a vacuum. That is, they wanted every surface to be decorated. They had paintings on all of the walls of their house. And one of the things that Roman people did in places like Pompeii, for example, you can see this in paintings there on the walls. They built elements that look like architectural elements. They built things that they painted things. They painted things that look like windows looking out. And that's where Michelangelo is getting it from. This very, very Roman approach to painting that he has on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. That's a not very good reproduction of the whole thing. Probably get a much better slide of that. Yeah, the weird sort of doohickey thing that God's kind of lying on there with his putti, his cherubs, all he sort of glides on over and gives Adam reason, is, you know, not just kind of like a brain. It's very, very exactly like a brain. And there was an interesting article published in the Journal of the American Medical Association about Michelangelo's brain in the Sistine Chapel. So that's fun. Yeah, and again, a consummate artist did so much. All right, well, so yeah, I mean, so I hope you can see how many different directions you can take this. There are all kinds of different stuff to talk about, looking at Leonardo and or Michelangelo, your choice. You can talk about their place in history. You can talk about their biographies. You can talk about their work. You can talk about the traditions and so on. And again, as I say, I just barely scraped the surface here. In any event, okay, good. Onward.